Welcome, everyone. This is our first webinar as a group on this topic. Our goal for this webinar is to just set some foundations, start building community around this topic, and share a little bit about our work so far. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So when you get a copy of the slides, you can click those links to our bios, but these are the 4 presenters for this webinar, and a link to our bios so you can see a little bit more about our professional backgrounds. We'll be sharing more about ourselves throughout the presentation. We don't want to go around and kind of read off our own professional backgrounds, but we'll share more about ourselves as it relates to the content throughout the presentation. But what we will cover today is setting some foundations for what are MENA identities, some of the themes from the literature of what's been covered about this population so far, and to set a space of community learning, community support, and we'll share more about our own background, and we'd like to engage you as well in this topic. As we do that, we want to share examples of our own personal and professional experiences. We know that we can't be completely inclusive or representative of the region or the population, but we want to share more about our experiences to show examples of in what ways does it matter to understand MENA identities and experiences in our profession. So first, just to get an understanding of who's here, we'd ask you to fill out this poll. If you can follow the QR code to the poll and share a little bit about yourselves.
So as you can see, the majority of folks, about 57%, are counselor educators, 30% counselors in training, and then a few counselor educators in training, and then other. Thank you for taking this poll. It just gives us an idea of who's joining us today.
In this first part of the webinar, we want to talk a little bit more about what is this term MENA, why do we use it, and a little bit more about the kind of diversity that it's meant to encompass. So this term is now a newly recognized racial and ethnic category on the census and on the federal guidelines for census data. This was kind of advocacy on the part of the Middle Eastern American community for the last 30 years to get this as a recognized category as part of the census. This term now is meant to include are anyone who has ancestry from the Middle East and North Africa. That is including countries from Morocco to Iran, from Turkey to Yemen. So it's a very diverse area in terms of like language, ethnicity, religion. But at the same time, there are some shared values, and shared values in terms of in many of the cultures from this region, there's a shared value of hospitality, of respect for elders, of a sense of community and the importance of community. And we all have some shared history, some touches with colonialism, with Islam in some ways being a part of this region, even if people are not Muslim themselves. And yeah, you can go to the next slide. And still, I think there's some complexity in this term, and that it's seen as from an American context of kind of racializing regions based on nationality and also by religion. and that even the term Middle East itself is not a way that countries or people from this region refer to themselves. It's a term that came from outside, from Europe, as a way to describe as like Europe as kind of the center of the world, and these countries are east of that in the Middle East. So, it's been something that we've fought for 30 years, but it's also not perfect in its terminology. And Marissa asked a good question of whether is this a kind of an in-group term, or is it something that people outside of the group are able to use? It definitely is something that it is appropriate to use this term to describe people's background as Middle Eastern, North African. It actually isn't really something that came from the way that people describe themselves. Yeah, so in the next slide, there are some other terms that might come up as part of trying to get away from this colonial ideal of describing the Middle East. Another term you might see is MENA, which includes Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African. SWANA, which is Southwest Asian and North African. Southwest Asia is a way to, remove that colonial perspective of the term Middle East.
Thank you, Shadeen. Yeah, I will take over from here and I'll talk just a little bit more about what MENA means, why it is a relatively new term for most people. And we certainly wanted to acknowledge that some of these identities are kind of just emerging formally. And that's why here later you will be able to take a look at this. We included these hyperlinks so you can see examples to what type of communities are using these terms, like how these are relevant to them. For example, with the AMENA, this is a term I personally learned from AMENA Psychology, Arab Middle Eastern North African Psychological Association. So AMENA Psych is an organization that actively advocated for more visibility of AMENA people, like Arab and Middle Eastern people in the psychology literature. So I want to acknowledge their efforts, really important. And there are other things like this SWANA example is, for example, when you go to this hyperlink, you will see how some university centers, student support services are using terms like this, because they really want to make sure that the students, the community is finding ways for their own sense of belonging. They want to be included and they want their own racial ethnic roots, upbringings to be also visible. As we all know, as mental health practitioners, it is very important, ethnic identity development, the sense of belonging, that visibility with both our strengths, but also unique differences is important for mental health, but also to be able to collect the data, to be able to show evidence of unique experiences, to look for the support needed. So these terms are being used by different terms. We particularly chose the term MENA because it's in the census, as Shadeen said, the census will collect data under that term. And we acknowledge it is a colonial term. And in addition to that, I just wanted to add that a lot of the boundaries that we showed earlier in this map, let me go back to that map if I can. So here, a lot of these maps are also determined by European colonial forces, especially by English and French after the First World War I and II. They drove the boundaries of these nation states, right? So they even imposed some national identities to this region, even though there were a lot of overlaps and connections between the cultural roots of the populations in this that lived in this large area for a long time after the Ottoman Empire. And after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, things, of course, started changing drastically in the region. So when we talk about these different MENA identities, we also want to acknowledge that, and this is also based on data from the United States, the census is also showing us that a lot more people are identifying as biracial or multiracial. So these terms are, again, created by a Western cultural framework, and also in the context of the United States. It's often very US-centric. So people do not always find it very easy to find the box that feels like that represents them. So a lot of people are also identifying with multiple racial ethnic identities because of the family compositions. So it's important to acknowledge that. And there is one category that I personally feel really close to, which is belonging ambiguity. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So for a very long time, especially maybe because I was an international student in this country for a very long time, my early years before I became an immigrant, it was not very clear to me, those like racial ethnic boxes. I come from a country where we don't really talk about racial ethnic diversity with the social historical context, but also I personally growing up in a war-torn region, like in the southeast Turkey, close to Iraq, and being very close to Kurdish-Turkish armed conflict. In my family, in my region, it was not okay to talk about ethnic diversity. So when I came to this country, I really had to educate myself, not only about the history of the racial trauma and identities in this country, but then also where I come from. And it is an ongoing journey. It's probably a lifelong journey. So my own experiences along the way helped me see that, again, I may not fit under certain categories, but it's important for me to acknowledge that I am a white woman. I have that white privilege. And in addition to that, also, I have these additional racial ethnic roots and a lot of values, a lot of strengths, but also challenges around that. So in my own journey, which is again an ongoing journey, I'm being very mindful of my privileges and also disadvantages as I change different contexts. I'm really making sure that I bring that awareness and that ongoing negotiation of what it means to hold certain privileges in certain spaces, especially. So belonging ambiguity, we included some parts in here, especially transnational feminist scholars and some Black feminist scholars have some very important contributions, how important it is that sometimes these these Western frameworks, and in this case, US-centric racial ethnic boxes are making people confused, but it's also hiding parts of them that they maybe should not. And it's important to embrace all parts of who we are and to acknowledge our roots, because there are a lot of strengths that comes with that. But again, there are also challenges that people need to be critically conscious about, so they can be aware of different types of, microaggressions, marginalizations, or other experiences that they might be facing. I wanted to add here the importance of intersectionality beyond the United States context. So for me also, being a Turkish woman, as I said earlier, I am not a stereotypical maybe MENA person from the perspectives of many. Like I need to acknowledge, especially my complicated relationship with Islam. Like sometimes in the United States, when we talk about the challenges of Muslim women, like we focus on the stereotypical challenges of Muslim women. Here, for example, if you are wearing a headscarf, that's making you a target of discrimination, stereotypes and biases and things like that. Versus for me as a Muslim woman, my identity and experiences are often invisible. And then the way I live that Muslim identity in my own country and region is very different, as you might be familiar from the events in Iran, for example, last couple of years. So Muslim women in that region are experiencing their religion and, marginalization, oppression around that differently. So look, for me also as a Muslim woman in my family, half of the women with, being more conservative or using headscarves, more modest, and other half being different. That's something that I constantly need to negotiate, and it shows up differently when I move in different spaces. So that's a fluid identity and my experience with that. Similarly, as I mentioned before, maybe a lot of my Turkish friends may not identify as MENA, but I see MENA as part of my identity because a significant part of my childhood was close to Iraq border, and I identify with challenges of being from a war-torn region and what the impacts of war can do one's family, mental health, and things like that. So, and finally, this is an image in the middle, like from the Gezi Park protests in Turkey. Like to me, it's also being from the region also means that growing up with some sort of like political tension and government violence. So violence, government-based or government-induced violence against women and other minorities. So these are some important things that, you know, keep coming up for me that I negotiate also in the space of the United States. So here, I think Shadin will continue to talk more about the immigration history for MENA people.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that this is also focusing on in American context, you know, for a moment too. So a lot, you know, and this is a history that in the US is usually not taught, you know, but understanding that people from the Middle East have, you know, been coming to this country for a long time, that that we describe it in these major waves. But even outside of these waves, you know, there are people from the Middle East who were part of the first explorations to the Americas, you know, that is not talked about at all. The first Arab American who actually died for his country died in the Revolutionary War in 1776. So, but just to have some understanding of kind of the main waves and the history of Middle Eastern Americans. The first was primarily Christians from the Levant, so like Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, what is known now as Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. At that time, it was either known as Turkey or as Greater Syria, because it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And these Christians came to the Eastern US mostly, and they worked as peddlers. So they would go home to home and sell items. And that allowed them to kind of like move out a little bit more, and for both men and women to work. And they were seen as other, you know, and they had to advocate to be recognized as white. So now as we advocate for having our own racial category, at that time they were trying to advocate to be seen as white in the US so that they could get the benefit of being able to become citizens. And this was something that was allowed for Christians, but not for Muslims. So you can see how that racial category also has like a religious component to it as well. That Christians are able to be white and to integrate in at least in some formal ways, but they were still seen as othered. And there were common stereotypes as them, you know, as salespersons, as they were kind of like, you know, upselling people or taking a bit, not honest. They were seen that way. That was a common stereotype at that time. Another wave was of Palestinian refugees in the 1950s who were coming to flee the conflict there at that time. And then the other wave was mostly Muslims from Iraq, Iran, Egypt, and other countries. And this wave is considered the brain drain. It was mostly educated people who were coming to pursue education or economic opportunities that they weren't able to get in their own countries. So that's what that wave is considered. And then more recently, we have refugee groups from different areas from the Middle East. A lot of times when we talk about undocumented immigrants in the US, people are thinking more of people from Mexico or South America, but there are actually, last year, or in 2023, there were 810 recipients of DACA who were from the region. So it is a population that is also at times undocumented or not recognized as having proper documentation. And there, you know, like I said, that there was, you know, the people from the region were contributing to the American society throughout its history, and people were coming even outside of these what's considered like a wave. My father came to the U.S. in 1980s, and he came from Syria. He came as a college student, and was able to, you know, come and integrate, and so that you can see that, you know, there's that people can come even from outside of like the common perceptions, like like Aleph mentioned. So, and then there's also this kind of racial history too of how people categorize. So, when my father came, he identified himself as being white, even though he identified strongly with being Arab and being Syrian and being Christian. But he knew that on the racial census, okay, I'm white because that was his race, right? But in subsequent generations, they're less likely to select white. So I know, like for me, it was a question that I had to bring to my parents. Okay, what do I pick on this census? Because I don't see myself on there. Like I don't see who I am on there. And I remember very clearly that moment of asking them, and I was probably like 9 or 10 at the time, and they told me, well, you're white. So you would pick white. And then but having that question also means that like either I'm not recognized, but I still have this sense of I know that I'm other, and that I'm not white. And it's interesting even for my daughter who is 10, is almost 10 now. I remember her coming home and they were talking about Martin Luther King and how in the past Black people and brown people were not treated equally, and they were having this conversation in their elementary school. And she told me that her friend who is white told her, "Oh, I'll treat you equally even though you're brown." So like there was this sense of, even if we put white on the census, we're not treated as white.
That's a wonderful segue into kind of how all these identities and meanings and very complicated, dynamic regional histories get sort of smashed together underneath this sort of essentializing and kind of bigoted perspectives. No matter what people put on their senses, people are negotiating their identities and trying to choose the best options that are present to them in the context of when they come. And we kind of exist under these larger sort of meta narratives about people from this region, right? And it's not exclusive, but a lot of these terms used to describe various forms of exclusion, bigotry, discrimination that can look like the interpersonal prejudice that people experience, name calling, hateful language, being excluded to the superstructural. We include things like politics, geopolitical conflicts, foreign policies, economic marginalization, these sorts of sort of structural racism, structural discrimination, and then the interpersonal discrimination that flows from it. And they all kind of coalesce around these ideas of Orientalism, colonization, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. I'll kind of briefly just give a very simple definition of all these terms, and then we can talk a little bit about how they may manifest and intertwine. Historically, within the Western civilization, there is this colonial relationship going back maybe 300-400 years ago into this region. And the colonial relationship is a lot like other colonial relationships. It wasn't a simple conquest or political change. That's been a dynamic throughout human history. But colonization in particular, first initially pursued by European powers, and with Japan being a late entry and at the events of World War II, but historically pursued through Europe and then later on, is this sort of not only political and military power over a region and occupation, but sort of resource extraction, a market relationship, commodities, and also as sort of an infiltration into the education and social sphere. It's a very, very different relationship than simple conquest. And that leads to sort of, these initial waves back in the day of Western and European thinkers and historians and social scientists, right, coming up with ways to sort of describe and control this region. And we inherit some of those ideas. So for instance, the ambiguity of Middle Eastern, North African, why is there a magical cutoff here when the entire history of this region is quite dynamic and intertwined, going into Central and South Asia. Myself, my family comes from Pakistan, but if you examine the languages spoken in that region, you'll see they're deeply intertwined with, say, Turkish and Arabic and Persian, right? I mean, these are hybrid languages and identities because historically the people from that region encountered themselves moving westward and eastward in very dynamic ways, and these identities were not fixed. But the colonial relationship sort of creates these really strong artificial boundaries between Central Asia, South Asia, magically cutting off the Middle East here. Of course, there's been movements to try to reclaim that, as we mentioned earlier, to try to signify that there was, civilizational connections this whole time. But either way, this sort of structuring of that relationship kind of then leads to, this sort of discourse around folks, being marginalized and being colonized, and thus, having these sorts of, identities and problematic or violent and these sorts of things. All these sorts of messages are given to make sure that we subordinate people historically from that part of the world. And that's sort of the kind of the colonial initial relationship. From there, moving into the 20th century, where decolonization happens, and then there's the formal removal of the colonial relationship, but there's still immense economic dependency, lack of power, a lot of interventions that come, internal military strife, all sorts of complex ongoing conflicts are continue to happen. And from there, we sort of get the modern relationship with certain media images, of the terrorist, right? Of this region being oppressed politically, gender apartheid, all sorts of these large, complicated or large dynamics sort of smashed into these essentializing categories where I think my co-presenters, Elif and Shadon, they mentioned like, hey, we're always negotiating these identities and boundaries, right? There's all these complex relationships between how one understands their religious faith and politics, and people are very diverse and dynamic within their own families even. But all that gets smashed into this large sort of meta structure, right? And some of those are very familiar to the things that we've encountered and what you've seen. I want to briefly speak a little bit about Orientalism, which is a term coined by Edward Said, and he kind of coined that term to sort of provide the cultural and sort of literary, and almost the phenomenological or the social relationship people had with this part of the world, right? How are these people presented in art and in literature and in movies? How is this kind of creation made, this Orient, right? Like, how are their stereotypes assigned? How are they perpetuated through these themes within within our movies, within our literature, within the social sciences, right? Orientalism has a huge role to play within the social sciences as well. And then from there, of course, these are deeply intertwined with questions of bigotry towards Muslims. Even if you're not Muslim, you kind of get put underneath that because of these orientalizing images and pictures, and of course, anti-Semitism as well. These are all deeply intertwined, including Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, both intertwined structurally at one point, though sort of existing a little bit differently now. But they're all sort of share the common themes of racial and religious bigotry being very intertwined with each other, right? Making it very difficult to detach how people understand race and religion, even going back into formal laws where people could be from the same region, the same village even, but if they happen to be a different faith, they're not seen as quote unquote white, right? And these sorts of things are deeply structured that way. So these are sort of the dynamics that exist with us today, and people from this part of the world frequently have to wear them and encounter them despite their own relationships being very different with these ideas. You can go to the next slide. So just kind of staying on the challenges, right? I mean, there's historic colonial, I guess you could call traumas, and decolonization, and then the eruption of political conflicts. And then specifically within the United States, get various forms of immigration and refugees who come from that part of the world for various different regions. And they're coming into this sort of superstructure that, yes, after immigration controls are lessened, particularly from Asia, you do tend to see, increasing immigration refugee quotas are expanded, there is a perception of growing tolerance, right? The United States is at that point locked into a Cold War with the Soviet Union, so that does lead to sort of liberal, cultural, progressive notions around race, immigration, and refugee status taking over. Yet the context of reception tends to be sometimes ambivalent. I know we've touched on them quite a bit, but there are conflicts around, how do we racially identify or ethnically identify? These are very, very small categories. If you happen to have a Muslim background, folks here don't have a good understanding of what that means, or if they do, they tend to be very scared of it. And from there, the various political conflicts, including, interventions, economic challenges, oil blockades, international terrorism, all these dynamics that you're all very familiar with, right, lead to sort of structural blowbacks within the United States in particular, as specifically around 9/11, but even before that, right? We have travel bans, increasing hate crimes, surveillance, Patriot Act. Many people from this part of the region, their rights were quickly taken away. They were illegally renditioned and taken to jail. A lot of legal surveillance and infiltration into communities, religious centers, that sort of thing. And that does lead to a different structural relationship, along with questions of identity and all sorts of general normative challenges of what it takes to immigrate into a host society. So those are two twin sort of challenges that kind of lead to mental health conflicts and challenges within families. There are two of them. Basically, just to summarize, there's the traditional acculturative stress, intergenerational conflicts, language, issues that are present within the community and present within all immigrant communities. Those are sort of normative conflicts. But because of the political and sort of the political and the social relationships going from there, you have this added structure of legal and domestic political legal concerns attempting to kind of police the community, and that leading to a secondary marginalization that happens. And this sort of leads to challenges around trusting professionals and not feeling that mental health is norm for people like you, and increase of hate crimes, lack of trust in institutions that you'll find for these various historic dynamics. I think we can go to the next slide.
I'll jump in here quickly to kind of illuminate a specific type of racism that has existed in my own life for my entire life, but I think it's more illuminated in the literature and on the news in the past 15 months, which is anti-Palestinian racism. That's related to silencing, erasing the identity of Palestinian people as a whole community, as well as kind of being dehumanized in different settings. Part of the recent kind of issue is kind of making the distinction between the difference between being anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia. I think for my whole life as a Palestinian, there's at best some ambiguity. Like, I don't know who you are. I remember my first time as a counselor in training where a client asked me, they just couldn't figure out who I am, which box I belong to, which category. And I remember kind of pausing there. I'm like, yeah, it's something you've never seen someone like me, maybe. And then in other places, as soon as I say I'm Palestinian, there's discomfort or silence or really not knowing what to do with this identity, as if I gave them kind of a question to make an opinion about, right? It's just who I am. That's how I identify. And also part of that is making an assumption that all Palestinians are Muslims, and related to that framing the issue of Israel-Palestine as a religious conflict. And by doing so, there's a lot of misconceptions that and stereotypes and falsehood against Palestinians, Muslims, or allies that are that kind of really prevent advocacy for Palestinian human rights and just identifying as Palestinian being as a controversial issue. In the past 15 months, I think we've heard a lot of stories from on October 14th, 2023, the little 6-year-old Palestinian boy who was killed, Wadi al-Fayoum, in the suburbs of Chicago, not too far away from me, actually. And I remember being terrified because I have a 6-year-old boy as well. So that's part of the narrative and other areas, other incidents in the past 15 months that have just really targeting Palestinians and dehumanizing Palestinians in general and specifically in the US. I think we can go to the next slide. I think I talked about some of the anti-Palestinian racism encompasses dehumanizing Palestinians, justifying violence against them, not failing to acknowledge their narrative as Indigenous people with stories and experiences with discrimination and oppression, and how that has also shaped the development of our identities as Palestinians. This is a study that we'll just reference here by the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism that found that there's a widespread anti-Palestinian racism in schools and other academic institutions. And this is a very recent study that feel free when we send the PowerPoint to click the link to read the whole study. I think we can move. When we talk a lot about challenges, when we talk about the MENA population, but it's really important not to forget about the strengths and resources. And I'll turn it over to my friend Walid here.
Yeah, no, I kind of went into the challenges and stereotypes, and then I gave really those heartbreaking stories about fear and the hate crimes that we have to live with and encounter. Understandably, it's really important to describe the challenges and in the community, but we all want to take an approach and say, what are the strengths? Despite such deep heterogeneity, diversity across every dynamic, even language, ethnicity, religion, there are still some common themes that we can sort of find that would be strengths in the community, and some of them are listed below or to the left, I should say. I think generally speaking, most of the people in the communities would identify and lean more towards collectivist understanding. So they place family as being really important, potentially filial piety or the respect of one's elders and their parents being really important in how they make life decisions that can sometimes be stressful, but also a source of strength. People feel really deep, thick bonds with their parents and their family and their extended family members. The role of the elderly, like in a lot of other societies, the role of the elderly is really important in terms of imparting wisdom, but also helping teach the culture, the faith, and helping further generations inherit that, keeping a very strong sense of identity going, which is protective against all these structural issues. Education is really important in the community. A lot of social mobility at certain times was found, especially in the latter immigration trends that Shadlin described, especially post-60s. The community did encounter a lot of social mobility as some of those structural barriers were released and went down. So you see entrepreneurial spirit, love of education, and certainly, some benefits that came from there. Of course, food and art and all these things, along with a lot of voluntary organizations and prominent folks who are part of American culture, Rolf Nader, for instance, is sometimes not understood to be Arab American, but yeah, he's a proud Lebanese American. Made a huge impact in the early 20th century. A lot of folks from different parts of the world have made impacts within American society and a national level, and of course in their local level. And there's a strong spirit of volunteer organizations, nonprofit organizations, highly charitable across different religious groups. So there are a lot of things that we can lean into and sort of build common themes around and organize well-being and connect on when we're, as we'll get into a little later, when we're trying to broach and develop community mental health interventions.
Thank you so much, Walid. Yeah, that was our part one. And I also just want to acknowledge we didn't say this explicitly at the beginning. We are pretty ambitious for this one, even though we call it Foundations Community Building, maybe we will try to make the second part a little bit faster. Our intention is not to go in depth with these. The first part was very important for us as the foundations. We also wanted you to get to know about us and why we came together in some ways. And in the second part, we will touch upon some topics about how our experiences in counseling and counselor education spaces may also show up in relation to these identities. But we will not go in depth. We don't have that time. But at the very end, we will ask you what more you want to learn about this topic, what type of strategies, techniques, resources. So this can be something for you to consider. And we are hoping in a future webinar with us and other guest speakers, we can go more in depth. So when we talk about our experiences in counseling, counselor education spaces, by now, I hope we don't need to clarify further why does it matter to become familiar with MENA identities and experiences, how diverse they are, sometimes how misperceived they are, and the levels of discrimination, oppression, and hate, like even hate crimes that we just mentioned. So these experiences, they come up in counseling appointments with our students and the counselor education spaces. These conversations, especially in the last couple of years, I think, more than that, with the political turmoil also in this country, right? A lot of conversations around the politics are also unavoidably coming up into our educational spaces. So we need to be better prepared. And our profession is giving us certain frameworks and standards to be able to reflect on these multicultural social justice topics. And at the same time, there are some limitations with them. So in this audience, we asked you earlier, a lot of us being counselors, counselor educators, we want to assume, again, we don't have the time to go in depth, but multicultural social justice counseling competencies might be the most familiar one for us. And these competencies are important. I will highlight two things about them in a minute, but we also want to let you know that other frameworks around intersectionality, like I mentioned earlier, so sometimes it's not just about being MENA, being Muslim, but depending on other additional identities that you might hold, immigrant, temporary immigrant, maybe your sexual orientation, how even those additional pieces around, I've mentioned being an international student, like these additional layers, identities are really also shaping our experiences in different spaces. So intersectionality is often something very helpful for us to identify those identities and also look into how they show up, how they impact one's overall well-being and needs. Advocacy competencies from ACA is something else. So they talk about individual level, institutional level, public level. It's making it very clear how, as counselors, we really need to advocate with and on behalf of our clients when they are impacted by these larger institutional systemic oppressions. We find that anti-racist counseling pedagogy frameworks are also very helpful, even though some of them can be very US-centric when they talk about anti-racism as we just presented. Sometimes they may not include, for example, the nuances of anti-Palestinian racism. Right. So it's important for us to be aware of that. And this is also part of why we are so grateful to NARTIC, like becoming our kind of umbrella, like kind of our home to create this project, because we really looked for a space like that is committed to anti-racism, but also from a global perspective, international perspective, being inclusive of all of these voices and experiences. And finally, we also highly recommend you to check about the frameworks around decolonization of mental health. So a lot of these frameworks are also really important for us that the indigenous practices, sometimes the Western frameworks also occupied, colonized these indigenous healing practices and those cultural roots of healing. And we also really need to go back and reconsider like how we can even redefine the meaning of mental health, well-being, supports, strengths, and all of that stuff. So these are some frameworks that we find helpful to understand the diversity of identities, experiences, but also support systems of MENA individuals and communities. So next, I just want to again briefly mention the multicultural social justice counseling competencies. They have sections about community, how they acknowledge that as a community, like we have both spoken and unspoken norms, values, regulations. So it is important for us to acknowledge, for example, in our counseling spaces, our counseling organizations, sometimes even email listservs, there are some spoken, unspoken norms. Like my colleagues and I like discussed often about, for example, the silence sometimes in response to certain types of topics, right? The representation of certain identities and experiences in our conferences. So these are how we show up and whether we are visible, sometimes how we are being responded or reacted, even with the silence, for example, are important to reconsider our community spaces, but then also come up with community intervention. So we see also our group, this presentation, but also we will introduce you later, starting this research project. We will share the survey with you. These are important community interventions, like people with different expertise areas, but also different identities, life experiences to come together and talk about the representation, the visibility, and the strengths that we can bring into our profession. And international global affairs is also something under the MSJCCs, but we often don't talk about it. Even the authors of these standards themselves in one citation are openly saying there's a failed opportunity to talk about what is social justice and advocacy in this international global affairs. Sometimes some people are seeing it as this is too complex, this is too big, this is not relevant to our counseling work. We can recognize and talk about all types of crises around the world. You don't have to. But when you have clients, when you have students that are bringing these identities and experiences as rooted around the world, right, as impacted by these international global, like you need to show that openness to really understand, explore what they are, and also work on your cultural humility to see these connections between local and global and how these larger systems are impacting. And I believe we provided examples to this so far. So, and I think, Dana, right, you will take it over from here.
So I think it's becoming really kind of obvious why this is significant, but a few points that we wanted to kind of hone down on is a lot of times the MENA population is either invisible within our counseling field in particular and the literature, or portrayed negatively, which really impacts the way our students are trained and the way we are not represented in research. An additional barrier, I think, is also not being recognized as a minority status in the census limits the data that we have. We don't have a lot of data, accurate data for people from MENA backgrounds, as well as MENA counselors and counselor educators are not really represented or supported within the counseling field in general, whether it's counseling leadership positions or counseling organization representations as well. And as we mentioned earlier, there's an increased stressors facing MENA individuals, including those counselors and counselors in training and counselor educators who identify with this background. So increased visibility, and this webinar is part of our efforts to increase visibility in professional settings, increase visibility in research, and paying attention to the MENA experience within our field and beyond is imperative to address and reverse some of these stereotypes and narratives that have been perpetuated in mainstream media and narratives as well. Think we can go to the next. Some of the common experiences in counseling spaces, and this is both from the literature, but also from our collective experiences as counselor educators and counselors in the field. Personally, I find my identity at best is invisible, and then at other times is hyper visible. The lack of the MENA category makes our identity more ambiguous or invisible and underrepresented in the literature. But at the same time, people from MENA descent are often hyper visible and are subjected to racial profiling, stereotypes, different types of discrimination against individuals from that background, specifically Muslims or individuals who identify as Arab and with that negative connotation, and some of the stereotypes that Willie discussed earlier. For those same reasons, there's also some individuals might be reluctant to self-identify as MENA. I've had colleagues ask me, do you openly identify as Palestinian in front of your students, and how do they receive that? And how does that look like being in a public institution and identifying as openly identifying as Palestinian or from the MENA population. So there are barriers to also counselors lack of understanding of this population because there's so much within group diversity. We talked about intersectionality and a long history, and stereotypes and kind of what misconceptions have been around for so long. So there's a lot of lack of understanding. And in addition to that, there's normalized prejudice and bias about MENA and Muslim people. These events that we and hate crimes that we hear about, the 3 students from Vermont who were shot because they visibly looked like they were Middle Eastern. These things are normalized in our society. Fear of identity being politically charged. I think I mentioned this more recently as a Palestinian. That's been kind of it seems like it's politically charged for some folks, as if they need to take a stand on who we are. So that's something just to keep in mind. We talked about the ambiguity, multiracial presentation to protect people from discrimination and marginalization. And sometimes people do identify and click that white category because they want to protect themselves from discrimination. For some reason, this population in particular, although in times where structural oppression has become illuminated in the past years, the same oppression has become increasingly endorsed towards individuals from MENA populations, and they've been an exception to advocacy efforts. When we talk about advocacy efforts within the counseling field, unfortunately, MENA population is left out. It's like this invisible, minoritized, and marginalized population that is forgotten. There's limited representation in leadership, counseling organizations, and then there's limited application and even mentioning when I read literature related to multiculturalism and cultural competencies, it's very rare that you see an example of someone from a MENA background. So that's something that's a common experience for folks who identify with the background. One of the areas of interest of mine, both personally and professionally, is this idea of cultural humility, that one's openness to cultural values and beliefs, that lack of superiority, being other-focused and relationally oriented approach. This framework has been in recent years applied and reflective in working with multicultural clients. And I think it can be appropriately and important to apply to when working with the MENA population, whether as a counselor or counselor educator. I think this concept of engaging in self critique to understand our own biases, but also being curious and open in understanding others' experiences. I think one of the experiences in counselor education where this was very present for me was in recent years, in the past couple of weeks. I was able to create space for my students to talk about how the Israel-Palestine issue has impacted them, knowing that I had students in my classroom who could have very different lived experiences, have different ties to the topic. I thought I was taking a risk because of who I am. I think that's something that became very present for me, being Palestinian, creating space for others, and also recognizing the maybe an anxiety and fear that other students might have if they don't share or they share certain points of views, and being able to open that space, knowing and taking that risk, knowing that there's also a power differential as a counselor educator, as their faculty member, but and being very nervous about it. I've taught for many years, but that was a nuanced experience for me. So using myself, recognizing who I am as a counselor educator, but also as a person, and kind of being vulnerable and with my students, I think was impactful for me, and I hope that it was impactful for them as well. Cultural humility can also aid in heightened critical consciousness, and that's something we aim to do with our students, with our counselors in training, and with counselor educators as well. And it also helps that taking that stance helps addressing the power imbalance that's inherent in our position, whether as counselors or counselor educators. So this cultural humility, embodying or enacting cultural humility, allows us to kind of let go of that expert role that we're used to in our positions, and recognizing that we can make mistakes and to forgive our mistakes and engage in self-reflection and also repairing ruptures if and when they happen. We can move to the next slide.
Yeah, just to quickly touch on, building on the cultural humility portion and then transitioning it to how we would conduct our counseling and therapy. We know that broaching tends to be the best way for us, that we know as a discipline and a profession, for us to cross, sometimes the large differences in the chasm unintentionally that's there between the client and the therapist. And it's really, really important that the professional take the assertive and important role to broach the difference, to acknowledge the difference. And we have a lot of wonderful standards and continuing progress that continues to emerge from there. And the whole point behind broaching is to, of course, to inculcate the humility that we need to want to reach out and understand and to observe a difference and want to have a deep and fulfilling relationship and therapeutic alliance with the client. And keeping all this sort of in mind with our background, there could be potential broaching opportunities around how do the politics and the events and things like that, potentially impact you and your family these days, without making an assumption that someone has a position or what that impact looks like, but simply broaching and opening the door to sort of observe perhaps that these are burdens and challenges that our clients carry from this part of the world, especially in moments during this past year when the geopolitical crisis is extremely salient and on people's minds. We talked about the importance of family, but importance of family always has a dualistic kind of notion to it. The more important family is, the more we need to have expectations for them and they have for us. So of course, without taking a position on what that family relationship looks like, or intuiting that one even finds it burdensome, right? We should be humble enough, but still broach perhaps once in a while. How does family show up in your life? I'm interested in learning about that, right? Of course, based on, at this point, hundreds of years of structural and interpersonal bigotry when it comes to people from this region, issues of transference and countertransference are going to be necessarily complicated and full of a lot of these psychic traps that are laid with some of this discrimination and bigotry. But not also exclusively, there are, of course, traditional countertransference and transference challenges of generation, of maybe sex differences. All that is there, plus all these other things that we've described. So being comfortable with broaching that. And of course, taking a position and asking, how do stereotypes influence your life without, going out there and saying this is exactly how it must look like. Of course, we know that there's stereotypes with being from this region, especially being racially and religiously classified or understood to be a certain thing. Especially there's gendered bigotry, there's gendered Islamophobia that comes with that assumption that you're oppressed and that you're not able to use your own agency. All those sorts of things are there and could be potential ways for us to sort of open the door and connect through the lens of cultural humility, but actually make it actionable and places for us to open up and to build that alliance. So here it's not exhaustive, but we'd like you all to walk away with potential broaching themes that one could use in sessions. Then we go to the next slide.
I'll briefly just say, because we talked about some teaching strategies, these are just sample. This is not the intention to go through these are some sample recommendations that would be appropriate and helpful as teaching practices in acknowledging the history of racism and the negative effects of racism through a contextual lens and using trauma-informed approach in teaching, using anti-racist teaching tools. In examples of that could be integration of racial content across the curriculum, fostering critical consciousness through different teaching methods, and also applying anti-racist perspective outside of the classroom. As counselor educators, our research focus matters. What we do in how we serve our profession, how we serve our departments, colleges, and universities, and community also matters. So that's all what I'm going to say for that, just for the sake of time.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. And maybe these are some of the topics you can tell us later that you would be interested to learn about any of these. What would this type of teaching look like, especially in relation to MENA-related topics? And sometimes I go back and forth. It's happening by mistake. I told my co-presenters, this is a new laptop for me. So I sometimes get a little bit lost, and my apologies for the journey between slides sometimes. Okay, so this is the last part that we want to do with you. Actually, the real last part will be the references, resources that we will offer to you, but we have about 20 minutes or so left today. So what we want to do, we want to hear from you about your experiences, questions in your mind. As we said earlier, we wanted to provide some foundations, introduce who we are, why we want to do this type of work, and some foundations, and also some community building. So what we want to offer here is that you don't have to read through this whole thing, but in our experience, and also based on the literature, we mentioned earlier the multicultural social justice competencies, a lot more work to be done in the community, international, global affairs. One thing is that we need to be better prepared to engage in critical conversations as counselors, as educators, as colleagues, even, right, as members of professional organizations. So instead of directly going into silence or avoiding certain types of topics and conversations, we can learn, we can constantly work on our own cultural self-awareness, our own maybe healing from racial ethnic discrimination, and also learning the knowledge, the information and skills to engage in more compassionate, non-divisive conversation. So we are curious, what type of practices do you use to engage in such conversations, if any? And if you are talking about, for example, national global conflicts, especially about as they relate to MENA individuals, what are some themes about the dynamics? So the dynamics could be like how much certain topics are being talked and how they are being reacted to, responded to, who gets to talk more about these topics, who gets to be more silent. But maybe there are also some themes around some content, right? What type of topics come up? How do they come up? How people define certain things? Like we gave some examples. Sometimes there are unfortunately basically the lack of knowledge about like what is anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism and things like that. And then also we will ask you to reflect on if you don't engage in such conversations, if there is silence, if people are sort of dismissing, neglecting these topics, how do you interpret that and how that might be impacting you? Especially if you are a person being directly or indirectly impacted by these national and global conflicts. So these are just some reflection questions. And what we want to do, we want to invite you to participate in either, let me check in with my co-presenters. Do we still want to do the Zoom breakout rooms? Like 5 minutes or so, or do we just want to use this anonymous sharing? We can also use the chat maybe just for the sake of time.
Yeah, if I guess if folks feel comfortable typing in the chat, that's okay. And I've also included an anonymous poll that we will not that we can
Yeah. We will not share the screen. The others won't see what you share. Okay, so you can just go, Dana just put that link in the chat. You can go click on that, and we will ask that you try to be as concise as possible. So again, what are maybe a critical incident or challenge look like when it comes to when these topics come up? So based on those reflection questions, maybe they helped you to come up with a critical incident. If you would like to share that concisely, and then Dana will keep an eye on that poll for us, and she will let us know some potential themes, topics that might come up in that poll. Just to save time, I will just introduce some things. These may or may not come up, but these are some of the common challenges that we were able to identify based on our own experiences, our observations. Some of them are also supported by literature and some reports. So you can go to some of these links later. So some of the common challenges that we see, like what leads to critical incidents, like people being misunderstood, highly charging conversations, and people avoiding to talk, or people blame each other, judge each other, people, all of these critical conversations. Sometimes some challenges are about accusations to politicize human rights and mental health crisis. So for many people, talking about some national or global level war, genocide, or things like that, can be about like human rights, mental health, and their wider impact on individual and community mental health. But sometimes when we mention these topics, some people might tell us, oh, you're politicizing. Don't go to the politics. We don't talk about that. Or we don't want to hurt XYZ community. We don't want to hurt XYZ people, right? Another common challenge is sometimes distorted definition. So again, unfortunately, our communities around the world are becoming more and more polarized. As I mentioned earlier, like with the intersectionality, for me also being an immigrant, I also see this a lot in my own country. Sometimes there are misperceptions and confusions around certain terms, and this is especially about defining anti-Semitism in the context of, for example, advocacy for Palestinian rights. So the society, this is actually a legal problem too. There are a lot of historical developments. We're happy to send you some resources if you are interested, like timelines about certain laws and regulations that define anti-Semitism in a certain way that makes Palestinians, that makes it almost impossible to advocate for Palestinian rights and the way that you talk about it. Another common challenge could be silence. I mentioned earlier, like fear of discrimination, fear of anti-retaliation. Going back into, again, the intersectionality, some of us will feel more at risk, right? More threatened if we say something. So if you are more visibly Muslim person, right? If you speak like Arabic in the public, like if you are active in some advocacy organizations, if you post something on your social media, a lot of these different dynamics unfortunately perpetuate this fear of discrimination and retaliation. Sometimes we also have a lack of consensus on the definition of social justice. We already mentioned about this. And another common thing that we see all of these like healing circles, people coming together, like let's support each other, like let's heal from this. But something that we discussed as a team, is this really the time for healing, or is this time for more listening and advocacy? So even though we are in mental health professions, sometimes we're rushing into that healing. But for people to start healing, they need to feel safe and secure, and they need to be heard. So we also should not dismiss those important basics of human survival. And also another common challenge is people perceive this, because they perceive this as political, they also say this is too complex to understand. So you don't need to understand 70 plus years of maybe historical trauma, right? Occupation and all of that, but you can still have the basic information, and there are lots of resources that we were able to share with you later on. But I want to turn to Dana. Dana, what did come up from the poll?
I was just nodding as you were talking because a lot of the things that you were talking about came up as themes. I think the partly lack of literature, information, misinformation, and trusted resources. So I'm glad that we have this resource section for folks who are also interested in that. Fear of retaliation and avoidance because of fear of retaliation, which is very present. Folks share experiences where there was retaliation and real consequences. I think those were some of the main kind of lack of information and resources to also be able to discuss and create these spaces for students, or discuss with clients as well. So that lack of focus in our field, I think, on the population to empower folks to be able to have these conversations and feel competent in doing so.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Dana. So I will just open it for questions at this point. I won't go through these, but I want to do, if that's also okay with the speakers, like later when you receive these slides, you can go and look into some of these best practices. Again, based on the feedback you will give to us, we can go back some of these topics. We shared some helpful resources, like things that helped us to learn about different perspectives about these different topics. So I want to move to the future directions like Q&A, and we highly encourage you to check our survey invitation. So this is a survey research. If you are working with AMENA individuals, or if you yourself identify as AMENA, please consider taking our survey. This is our first step in the research process. We're just trying to understand the identities, experiences in the counseling spaces. And then we also highly recommend that you check about NARTIC, like learn more about NARTIC, consider joining us. And we will share more emails about our project. So keep an eye on the emails. We will announce more things coming up. And finally, there will be a link here. So this is the last thing before we ask for questions. But what topics would you like to see addressed in future webinars? Maybe you want us to go more in depth with one of these topics in this webinar, or maybe something else that you hoped that we spoke something else we didn't. So what else you would like to see in the future webinars? And Dana put that link. And also, I'm just kind of rushing it here, Shadeen. Just AMCD, MENA Americans Ethnic Concerns Group. There is an MENA-related professional association subgroup under AMCD. So if you are interested, please reach out to Shadeen about it. So Shadeen is leading the advocacy efforts with other friends in that organization. Thank you so much for your patience. I will stop sharing for now.
I had a quick question. I don't know if this is relevant. So I don't consider myself as a MENA person because I'm not from the Middle East area. I grew up in Southeast Asia, and I'm Indian by origin, but we grew up in Brunei and Singapore. So, c- can I join? I mean, I don't know where I fit in with this. So I'm like, do I join or do you think it's... And the other thing is, yeah, I am a counselor educator in school counseling. Will I connect in this group? I don't know. I'm not even sure. Now that you all are all here, I'm like, am I someone who would join, who will connect in this group? Do you all have counselor educators? I mean, school counselor educators, because I'm in school counseling. Hi, Lauren, from University of Florida. I went there.
Thank you for that question, Shifa. Definitely. As we said earlier, we are using the term MENA, but it doesn't mean we want that to be as inclusive as possible. I mean, there are only so many different definitions, like, terms, things like that. Like we mentioned all of those, like SWANA, like SINA, right? All of that. So people have different racial, ethnic identity roots, sometimes cultural values. Like, as I said, for my own, like, I mean, my own religious upbringing, my own intersectional experiences, like, I feel close to many cultural values with MENA, but some of my other Turkish friends may not, right? So it's all about like where you see yourself close to in terms of those roots, those values, those experiences. And this is also not just for people who identify as MENA. Our goal here is to just raise more visibility, like to help our community to learn more about these diverse identities and experiences. So yeah, any counselor educator is very welcome to come and learn with us. We are also learning from each other in this process because again, our literature is very limited at this point. So that's why we're
Yeah.
doing both this, but also research. Thank you again for your question. Any other questions or comments about this project in general or the webinar?
And I think to add to that, yes, definitely everyone who's interested in the topic is definitely welcome to join and to be involved. And I think like some of the rationale that I hear about, oh, why aren't we included is like, oh, well, there's not enough. There's not enough of you. It's because the population is small. But I think part of what we wanted to show is that it's not that, we've been here this whole time, we're here. It's not just like a new issue that we need to talk about now and then be done with. It's been there's been intentional silencing throughout our history, and we want to be more visible and be leaders as counselors, be leaders and bringing up that visibility.
I think I just want to add a little bit. First of all, I thank the presenters for doing a great job in putting together a very engaging presentation with information for us to think about. And I want to also think that in response to Shifa, I think it's so important for school counselors to actually also get it because there are a lot of there are many AMENA people in the school settings, right? And oftentimes the school children, like they don't know how to fit in, and the school teachers and principals, they do not know how to work with them. And if the school counselors are not trained to know how to even appreciate the background of the folks, because sometimes school children are in their own transition because they may not, for whatever reason, because of internalized oppression, they may want to distance themselves from their own roots, right? Which we see that it happens in a lot of other groups, like folks from the Hispanic background. Some parents do not want them to speak Spanish because they want them to get more into the American culture, so to speak. So I think similar dynamics might happen because I've seen that happening in Asian families where children only speak English when they come home and do not want to speak in their own language anymore because of that kind of pressure to conform. But we understand that developmentally, right? So I think it's very important for us who are training our school counselors to know how to recognize, to know how to work with children from that background and with the family from that background. Imagine that if they are immigrant or because of the refugee status or whatever other status, they may not feel that they can navigate the system or the school system, district, whatever that is. So it's very important. And I wish that we have more school counselors too. Maybe we should do one session on helping school counselors to recognize and to position themselves or even look out for specific microaggressions that tend to be directed towards this group, which they themselves may not be even aware of, because they are more looking. They're more. We train them more to look for other like anti-Asian sentiments, anti-Semitic, and anti-blacks, right? But not anti-AMENA. So these are some of the things that we need to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kokmon. And I saw a hand from Abdul Rahman, I believe.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. One of the things that I thought about as I was hearing is just the aspect of the diversity among the MENA population. I bet you talked about that. Because of the time mismatch, it sounds like I came a bit late. Just the concept of the cultural assimilation and the cultural humility and like the fear that some of the kind of older generations may have about just like being in the society in here and navigate the complexity of the society, just as the previous speaker was saying. That diversity, I think, is also something we need to focus like some light on in the research, just to gain that perspective, because like the cultural assimilation that newer generation or maybe second or third generation of MENA population here in US may experience is impacting like the whole kind of experience of being able to present like different concerns or topic of concern for this population.
Thank you. Thank you, Abdul Rahman. We appreciate that. Yeah, these are really important for us to enrich our own perspectives and other things that we can research about and consider for future webinars as well. I put a relevant reference from our slides in the chat based on also this point, but also previous questions. It's 10:30, so we want to respect your time. Again, I will stay just in case there are more questions, comments in here. Thank you so much for coming. This is end of the academic semester. For many of you are being educators. I want to say one last time, we want to acknowledge that we could not represent, talk about so many other aspects of MENA identities and experiences here. So when we highlighted these things, it was certainly not meant to exclude, dismiss the lived experiences, the impact, the pain of other communities involved in all of these conflicts and all of these experiences. That's something very important to us. And we're always open for more people to join us with those additional perspectives. So help us also engage in those conversations. Please go back to that section with critical conversations. Maybe we will make that a separate feature webinar to look together into like how we can practice those strategies to bridge our differences without trying to persuade each other, convince each other. How can we see those like common values, needs, how we can work together toward global social justice and peace. So that is really the wish and hope for all of us. Thank you so much for being here, and please reach out to us. I will say more here. And I will stop recording. My co-presenters, did you want to add anything before we close?
Thank you, everyone.
Great to see everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for taking the time to be with us.